At 18, they gave her to an Apache as punishment. But what he did next shocked the entire town. Leaves whispered above her as the narrow forest trail opened into a wide, sun-dappled clearing, and the 18-year-old girl stumbled forward between the men escorting her, their boots crunching over roots while they pushed her toward the circle of tall pines that marked the edge of the Apache camp. Smoke drifted softly from a cooking fire ahead, and the low murmur of tribal voices hummed through the warm air as women paused their work and children stopped mid-play to watch the strangers enter their world. The men who brought her weren't angry. They looked uneasy, almost afraid, as if handing her over was something they'd agreed to but didn't want to witness, and every step she took made her grip the frayed edges of her shawl tighter, wondering if she was the only one who didn't understand why she had been chosen as punishment for a quarrel she never caused. The forest smelled of cedar and wild earth, a scent so clean it almost hurt after the choking dust of the path behind her, and when the group stopped at the center of the clearing, she felt the weight of a dozen Apache eyes settle on her with quiet calculation rather than hostility. Then a single figure emerged from the shadows beneath a leaning oak, a broad-shouldered Apache warrior with calm eyes and long, wind-tangled hair, the kind of presence that made the clearing shift around him, as though even the forest held its breath at his arrival. He said nothing at first, simply walked forward with slow, steady steps, stopping a few feet away from her and the men who delivered her, his posture neither welcoming nor threatening, just impossibly composed. One of the escorts cleared his throat awkwardly, muttering that she was being given to the tribe for discipline. But the warrior's gaze flicked toward him with a quiet, cutting disbelief that made the man's voice falter mid-sentence. Birds rustled high in the canopy as the warrior finally looked at her, not examining, not claiming, just seeing her in a way that felt startlingly human after days of being treated like a burden no one wanted to carry. She swallowed hard, unsure whether to bow her head or hold it upright. But before she could decide, the warrior lifted one hand slightly, an open palm gesture toward her, slow and controlled, not to touch but to reassure, a silent message saying she wasn't in danger here. The men behind her stiffened, expecting anger, rejection, or something violent, but instead the warrior stepped aside a single pace, creating space for her to move out of their reach. And in that tiny shift, the entire forest seemed to lean in, sensing that the punishment meant to break her had just bent in a direction no one expected. The clearing grew even quieter as the warrior shifted his weight, turning his body just enough to place himself between her and the men who had dragged her through the forest, and the escorts, already uneasy, stepped back instinctively as if they'd approached a line the trees themselves refused to let them cross. The air felt different now, heavier with the realization that the Apache man wasn't reacting the way they expected, and the girl sensed it too, her breath catching as she watched him study the situation with a calm, disciplined focus that made their decision to gift her here feel suddenly small and shameful. One of the men tried to explain again, stammering that she had brought dishonor by refusing a town demand, that the punishment had been decided for her attitude, not her actions, but the warrior didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on her, steady and unblinking, as if trying to read what fear had done to her spirit. Behind him, several Apache women exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern, and an elder seated near the fire raised his chin, watching with the solemn patience of someone who had seen too much cruelty disguised as justice. The warrior finally spoke, his voice low and even, asking her name. Not the men's explanation, not the reason for her presence, just her name, and the simplicity of the question hit her with unexpected force. No one had asked her that since the punishment was announced. She whispered it, barely audible, and something softened in his posture, a subtle recognition that she was not what she had been accused of being. One of the escorts sputtered that it didn't matter who she was, only that she had been handed over, but the warrior lifted his hand. Not high, not dramatically, just enough to silence him, and the gesture carried more authority than any raised voice could have. A breeze moved through the clearing then, tugging at the loose strands of her hair, scattering ash from the fire, bending the tall grass as if nature itself shifted its allegiance in that subtle moment. The warrior took one step forward, slow and in full view of the tribe, then gestured for her to come to his side, not as property, not as prisoner, but as someone under his protection until truth was understood. The escorts tried to protest, muttering about the agreement and what the town expected him to do, but the warrior didn't respond. He simply turned his head slightly, giving them a look so calm and firm that one man lost his nerve and looked away. And as she took a hesitant step toward him, the forest seemed to close the space behind her, erasing the path that had dragged her here and opening a very different one ahead. One built not on punishment, but on a kind of honor the men who delivered her couldn't begin to comprehend. She stood frozen at the edge of the warrior's shadow, unsure whether she had truly been invited to step forward or whether fear had twisted the moment into something she wished it to be. But when she hesitated, the warrior didn't pressure her or turn away. Instead, he lowered himself slightly, just enough to reduce the height between them, before extending one hand palm down toward the earth, a small, controlled motion that asked for nothing except trust, and the entire clearing seemed to hold its breath as the meaning of the gesture rippled through those watching. The escorts stiffened, one whispering that the warrior was refusing the punishment entirely, but the tribe ignored them, their gazes fixed instead on the girl as she stood trembling beside the tall grass, her hands clutching the fabric of her skirt to keep them from shaking. A child near the fire inched closer, wide-eyed, sensing something gentle beneath the warrior's stillness, and even the elder leaned forward slightly, recognizing a gesture older than any law the town had tried to impose. Sunlight filtered through the branches above, dappling patches of gold across the warrior's arm and the ground between them, and for a moment she felt the weight of the forest soften around her, as if the trees themselves understood she needed more strength than she had left. Slowly, barely more than the shift of a breath, she stepped toward him, her boots sinking quietly into the soft earth, and when she reached the space within his reach, the warrior did nothing more than angle his body so his presence shielded her from the escort's eyes. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He simply stood between her and those who had brought her here, as though that single act corrected something that had gone wrong long before this morning. The escorts looked away first, uncomfortable under a silence that exposed their intentions more clearly than accusation ever could, and one muttered that they should leave before the tribe changed its mind. The warrior's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in restrained disappointment, and he raised one finger slightly, a gesture signaling them to go, to take their fear, and leave the girl behind with someone who saw what they refused to see. As the men backed into the trees, the warrior let out a slow breath, the kind that comes from choosing honor over tradition, and the girl felt an unexpected warmth settle in her chest. Not safety, not yet, but the fragile beginning of something she hadn't felt in a long time. The sense that someone, somewhere, was finally standing still for her. The escorts had barely disappeared into the trees when murmurs rose around the clearing. Not loud or hostile, just the low hum of a community trying to understand why a trembling girl had been delivered into their world like a burden someone else didn't want to carry. And the warrior stood still beside her, his arms relaxed at his sides, but his posture firm enough to let everyone know this matter touched a deeper place than simple discipline. A young Apache woman stepped forward first, her expression a mix of curiosity and quiet concern as she circled the girl with careful eyes, noting the dirt smudges on her sleeves, the thinness of her shoes, the way her breathing hitched each time a voice rose even slightly. She asked the warrior something in a soft, clipped tone, and though the girl didn't understand the words, she recognized the tension in them. Was this stranger a danger or a wronged soul abandoned to the wild? The warrior answered with a slow shake of his head, then gestured toward the path the escorts had vanished down, a silent explanation that the cruelty had not begun here, but outside the forest, in a place where fear disguised itself as justice. The elder by the fire lifted his carved staff and tapped it twice against the earth, calling the tribe to attention, and the clearing quieted instantly as he asked the warrior to speak. But instead of giving a long explanation, the warrior simply touched 2 fingers to his own chest, then motioned toward the girl, then toward the trail. 3 gestures that told the entire story. She was brought here in shame, but her shame wasn't hers to carry. A rustle moved through the clearing like wind passing through the branches, a collective shift in understanding. And the girl felt her throat tighten as the truth finally hung in the air without excuses. She opened her mouth to speak, to insist she hadn't done anything wrong, but the words tangled in her chest, and the warrior stepped half a pace forward, shielding her from the eyes that had sharpened in sympathy rather than suspicion. The elder studied her face with a long, steady gaze, then turned his attention to the warrior, weighing his reaction against the tribe's traditions, and finally he gave a single nod, a signal that she would not be treated as punishment here. Relief washed through her so quickly her knees almost buckled, and though the warrior didn't touch her, she felt his presence steady her, a calm anchor in a forest that suddenly felt less like a place of exile and more like ground she might, for the first time, learn to stand on. The elder's nod had barely settled into the clearing when the warrior turned slightly, motioning for the girl to follow him toward the shaded side of camp, where the trees formed a natural archway over a small stream, and though her steps were hesitant, she trailed behind him with the cautious trust of someone learning to breathe again after hours of holding everything inside. The stream glimmered like a silver ribbon through the undergrowth, its water cool and clear, and the warrior knelt beside it without a word, cupping his hands to gather water before offering it to her, not pushing it into her grasp, not assuming she would accept, just holding it patiently until she felt safe enough to take it. She leaned forward, trembling as the cool water touched her lips, and for the first time since being dragged from town, her breath steadied into something that didn't feel like a desperate fight for air. The warrior waited until she drank, then rinsed a strip of cloth in the stream and placed it on a smooth stone near her feet, a gesture so gentle it made her blink in confusion. She had been treated like a problem for so long that the idea of someone tending to her comfort felt strange, almost unreal. A young Apache girl wandered over, curiosity bright in her eyes, and without speaking she handed the visitor a small woven basket filled with pinole and berries, the kind of offering usually reserved for travelers or guests. The warrior gave the child an approving nod, then motioned for her to sit at a respectful distance, letting the frightened newcomer choose how close she wanted company. Birds trilled overhead as the canopy swayed softly, casting shifting shadows across the ground, and the girl found herself staring at the way the warrior moved, quietly, deliberately, as if every action had a purpose that did not involve control or intimidation. He gestured towards the water again, inviting her to wash her face if she wished, and she did, loosening dust from her skin, letting the coolness sweep away the marks of the long walk and the shame she'd been forced to carry. Across the clearing, some of the tribe watched with curiosity, others with understanding, but none with the suspicion she'd expected. Instead, there was a calm acceptance in their eyes, as if they recognized a wounded spirit being steadied, rather than a wrongdoer facing judgment. When she finally sat back on the mossy bank, breath slowing, shoulders lowering, the warrior settled a few feet away, not close enough to overwhelm, not distant enough to abandon, simply present in the quiet way someone stands guard without making a promise they can't keep. And in that soft corner of the forest, with sunlight filtering through the branches and the stream whispering beside her, she realized this was the first act of care she'd been shown in far too long, offered not because she deserved it or earned it, but because it was the way honor lived here. The light filtered softer through the canopy as she sat beside the stream, her palms still damp from the water, when the sound of brush crunching behind them made her flinch instinctively, a reflex carved into her after days of judgment and punishment. The warrior rose before she could panic, not abruptly, not with aggression, but with a smooth, controlled motion that placed his body between her and the approaching footsteps, his broad silhouette forming a barrier that made the forest feel suddenly smaller and safer at the same time. Two older men from the tribe stepped into view, their expressions stern but not hostile, carrying woven satchels and speaking quietly to the warrior in a tone that suggested concern rather than accusation. They gestured toward the trail where the escorts had vanished earlier, then pointed at the girl, then back at him, asking questions she could not understand but could feel pressing heavily in the air. The warrior listened without interrupting, his jaw tight but his posture steady, and when the men finished, he didn't offer excuses or defense. He simply lifted one hand and made a single, deliberate gesture toward her, palm facing inward, the kind of motion that said everything without a word. She is under my protection. The clearing stilled. The two men exchanged glances, surprised not by his refusal to hand her back, but by the quiet certainty behind the gesture. And after a tense silence, one of them nodded slowly, acknowledging the weight of his decision. The girl watched, heart pounding, unsure whether she had just been accepted or made the center of a larger conflict. But the warrior turned his head just enough for her to see his profile, and the calm in his expression grounded her more firmly than any explanation could have. A bird called sharply from the treetops, breaking the moment, and the two men finally stepped aside, allowing the warrior to lead her back toward the main clearing. He didn't touch her or speak as they walked, only glanced over his shoulder once to ensure she was following, and that small, silent check was enough to quiet the fear swirling in her chest. When they stepped into the open space again, the tribe paused what they were doing, not freezing in alarm, but shifting in a way that acknowledged something had changed. The warrior stood tall beside her, saying nothing, yet his stillness carried a message the entire camp heard. Whatever fate she came with, it would not be the one she left with. And in that unspoken promise, the forest itself seemed to breathe differently, as though recognizing that the moment of turning had finally arrived. By the time the warrior guided her back into the heart of camp, the weight of the day had finally begun to settle into her bones, and the quiet attention of the tribe, measured, watchful, neither harsh nor indulgent, pressed against a place inside her she had kept sealed since long before she entered the forest. She didn't break immediately, didn't crumble in front of the circle of women grinding corn or the children playing with carved sticks. But when the warrior paused beneath a tall juniper and angled his body slightly toward her, giving her room to breathe, something inside her wavered in a way she couldn't hide. The camp sounds grew softer, like the world was stepping back to give her a moment she hadn't asked for, and her vision blurred as she swallowed hard, trying to keep the tremor in her throat from becoming a sound. The warrior didn't move closer, didn't offer words that might startle her into retreat. He simply shifted his stance so she could lean against the tree if she needed to, a small adjustment that felt like permission to let the strength she'd been pretending to have finally slip from her fingers. She pressed her hand to her forehead, breath hitching, and the camp faded into a dull hum as a sob she'd carried for days pushed up through her chest. One Apache woman, older, with long, silver-streaked braids, noticed before the rest and stepped forward slowly, her palms visible, her pace unhurried, her presence the kind you approach the wounded with. She didn't touch the girl, only knelt nearby and offered a folded hide blanket within reach, her eyes soft, understanding that comfort works best when it asks for nothing. The girl sank down onto the earth, shoulders shaking despite her effort to stay silent, and the warrior turned slightly away, not out of rejection, but to give her dignity while still remaining close enough that she felt protected. The forest around them breathed in steady rhythms, shadows swaying across the ground as if the trees themselves were shielding her from every memory that had pushed her here. Minutes passed before her sobs softened, leaving her drained but lighter. And when she finally raised her head, the warrior glanced back at her with the kind of calm that anchored the world. She didn't thank him. Couldn't yet. But he dipped his chin once, acknowledging the battle she had just fought within herself. And for the first time since her punishment was declared, she felt the faint, steady warmth of something she thought she'd lost forever. The sense that she was no longer facing her life alone. The girl had barely wiped the last tear from her cheek when a sharp whistle cut through the clearing, followed by the urgent beat of feet running across packed earth, and several Apache youths burst into view, breathless and alarmed as they shouted toward the elder and pointed frantically toward the ridge that skirted the camp. The commotion drew the entire tribe's attention, and the warrior, sensing danger before words reached him, stepped in front of the girl without hesitation, placing a steady hand in the air to signal she remained behind him no matter what was happening. Within moments, 2 scouts slid down the ridge, dust clouding around their ankles as they reported that riders from the town were approaching the forest's edge. Fewer than before, but armed, loud, and angry enough to disturb every bird in the canopy. A ripple of unease moved through the tribe, not fear, but the guarded readiness of people who knew too well how quickly outsiders could twist a rumor into a threat. The elder raised his staff, calling the camp to order, and the warrior stepped forward, giving a deep, respectful bow before offering himself as the one who would speak at the boundary, a choice that made several men exchange conflicted glances. Defending the girl meant inviting conflict with those who believed she had been delivered here for punishment, not protection. The girl's stomach clenched as voices rose around her, some urging caution, others questioning why they should risk backlash for a stranger. And though none of the words were directed cruelly at her, the doubt stung like a spark thrown onto dry brush. She kept her gaze on the soil until the older woman who had offered the blanket earlier approached and placed a firm, reassuring hand, not on her skin, but lightly on her shoulder wrap, granting her the strength to lift her head again. Across the clearing, the warrior made a single, decisive statement, his voice low yet carrying across the air with the clarity of someone who had already accepted the weight of his choice. Whatever came from the ridge, he would face it. The elder studied him for a long, tense second, then nodded once, granting him authority to speak for the tribe in this moment of crisis. When the warrior turned back toward the girl, his eyes held no fear, only the resolve of someone who refused to let injustice repeat itself under his watch, and she felt her breath steady at the sight. As he strode toward the ridge with several scouts falling in beside him, the entire camp shifted, some anxious, some ready, all aware that the next few moments would define not only her fate, but the honor he had chosen to stand on. And in that charged silence, surrounded by strangers who might soon become something else entirely, she realized that the battle was no longer just about her punishment. It was about whether truth would be allowed to rise in a world that had tried to bury it. The warrior reached the ridge just as the riders broke through the tree line, their horses stamping nervously at the sudden shift from open plains to dense forest. And though the men carried rifles slung across their saddles, it was the loud certainty in their voices, not the weapons, that revealed what they truly came for. They shouted about property, punishment, promises made and owed. But when the warrior lifted one hand, the ridge fell silent except for the restless snort of a horse. He didn't raise his voice to match theirs. He simply spoke with the calm weight of someone who knew that truth didn't need volume to be heard. He explained, measured and steady, that the girl had arrived frightened, exhausted, and wrongfully shamed, and that no tribe honoring its ancestors would hand a wounded spirit back to those who had broken it. The riders pushed back immediately, insisting she had brought dishonor, that she defied their rules, that she belonged to the town's judgment, not to strangers hiding in trees. The warrior didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped just slightly to the side, revealing her in the distance below the ridge where she stood among the tribe. But not behind them, not concealed like a prisoner. She stood upright, wrapped in the blanket the older woman had given her face still pale from crying, but her posture steadier than it had been hours ago. The riders stared, clearly expecting to see a defiant troublemaker. Instead, they saw a young woman stripped raw by fear, surrounded by people who had offered her dignity in the silence they denied her. One rider's expression cracked first, guilt flickering across his features as he finally understood the weight of what they had done. The warrior said nothing more. He didn't need to. The truth was visible in her trembling stance, in the way she clutched the blanket like armor, and in the camp standing quietly at her back without raising a weapon. The men shifted uneasily, muttering that they hadn't meant harm, that things got out of hand, that she should come home. But the word home rang hollow in the air, brittle and insincere. The elder stepped forward beside the warrior, then, his voice strong despite age, declaring that the forest recognized her, that she had been treated with dishonor outside its borders, and that she would not be returned to those who delivered her in shame. The riders hesitated, realizing they no longer held moral ground, and one finally tugged his reins, turning away before the truth shamed him further. And as the group retreated down the trail, grumbling, defeated, and stripped of righteousness, the girl felt something shift inside her. Not triumph, but the steady, cautious recognition that she had finally been seen as a person, not a punishment. When the riders' shadows finally disappeared between the pines, the camp exhaled, as if the forest itself had been holding its breath, and the warrior walked back down the ridge with the slow, deliberate calm of a man who had carried the weight of another's fate and refused to bend under it. He didn't stride triumphantly, didn't seek praise or thanks, just moved with the sure-footed steadiness of someone returning to a responsibility he had already accepted long before the confrontation began. The girl stood where she had been, fingers gripping the blanket edge, her knees unsteady from the tension that had held her upright through the entire ordeal. And when he reached her, he stopped a respectful distance away, giving her space to decide whether she wanted closeness or time. She didn't step forward, but she didn't shrink back either. She stayed rooted, breathing slower now, the fear that had ruled her since dawn finally loosening its hold. The elder approached with several women behind him, each carrying small items: water, a soft hide mat, a bowl of broth, the quiet symbols of someone no longer seen as punishment, but as a human being in need of rest. One of the younger women cleared a place near the fire and gestured for the girl to sit, not insisting, simply offering, and after a moment of hesitation she lowered herself onto the mat, the warmth of the flames easing the chill that had clung to her since she was taken from town. The warrior settled a few paces away, neither guarding her nor abandoning her, just establishing a steady presence she could return her eyes to whenever the world felt too large. The camp moved around them with its usual rhythm, Children resumed their play, women continued their grinding, men discussed the riders in low tones, but a subtle shift had taken place. No one looked at her with suspicion anymore. The crisis hadn't erased the pain she carried, and she knew nightfall would bring memories she wasn't ready to face. But for the first time in months, she felt a fragile safety settling into her chest, a sense that healing was possible even if she didn't know what it would look like yet. The warrior met her gaze once, offering a small, steady nod. Not a promise of a new life, not a claim over her fate, just an acknowledgement that she had endured something heavy and had not been left alone afterward. And as dusk softened the forest and firelight warmed her face, she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, breathing in the unfamiliar comfort of a place that had not asked for her pain, but had accepted it anyway, leaving her with something she had never expected to find here. A beginning. Thank you for watching Echoes of the West. Stories like this remind us that dignity can survive even the hardest places, if just one person chooses honor.